Hi, this is an introductory neg strategy lecture for the Arctic topic. So this will be the general plan for what we're going over. And a really good place to start is what you're doing in the pre-round, which is as soon as your pairing comes out and you have the 30 minutes before the round where you're preparing. In this, the 2N and the 1N should divide their work. How you divide it is generally partner dependent, but the 2N should be the neg captain, which means that they're dictating the broader strategy. They're looking at the AF and thinking, okay, what type of generics do we have against it? What do I want the 2NR or potential 2NRs to be? And then working backwards from there. So that means once you've decided on a few options that you think would be a good 2NR against this AF, then you're thinking about potential block splits that could lead up to it. But that doesn't mean that you're being set in stone on a 2NR before a round begins, because if the 2AC messes up something or undercovers something, then it's always good to be able to shift your strategy. In the meantime, the 1N should be working on the 1NZ. The 1N might be working on the off case or the case, while the 2N does the other half on it. Once again, is partnership dependent, so how you divide that section of the work is something you'll talk about with your 1N. You should also try to find the team's previous 2ACs, which you can probably get from the wiki, or looking at email chains. Then you can start prepping out the 1NR so that you can save time later in the debate. For a quick speech by speech, during the 2AC, both partners should be flowing because the 2AC will often not read all of the analytics and cards that are in the document, so it's important to keep track of what they read so you only respond to arguments that they actually made. Also, you need to be flowing for theory because dropping 2AC theory arguments like Kondo can instantly lose you the round, which is something you want to avoid. In the block, you want to be setting up potential 2NRs, which means that you want to have a lot of different combinations that you can go for in the 2NR. So, for example, if you have a disad and an advantage counterplan, then the possible 2NR could be the disad and the advantage counterplan, or it could be just a disad, which is a good thing to have. In the 1AR, both partners should be flowing because the 1AR is super important. You want to see where the 1AR made strategic mistakes that the 2NR can capitalize on, which is important for deciding what you want to go for when there are a lot of viable options. And the 2NR is definitely the hardest speech in debate because you have to both answer the 1AR while preempting the 2AR, which is really difficult because you have to extend your own offense while also being defensive enough that the 2AR cannot capitalize on something. You should be realistic with yourself and reflect on what parts of the debate you think that you're winning and which parts you think that you're losing. You don't want to spend 3 minutes on something that they dropped, but only 30 seconds on an argument that might be the 2AR. Okay, first is laying plans. This is mainly about pre-tournament prep and what you want to do leading up to a competition to maximize your chances of winning. First is you want to have argument diversity. That means that your only file shouldn't be the Russia disad because a lot of teams will read apps that don't have anything to do with Russia. So if you have a lot of diverse arguments, like maybe you have a team minerals file, you have a CapK file, you have a process counter plan, then you have a few disads, that's really great because those can work against a lot of different types of AFs. Then you should be realistic about what you can do to prepare. You have a lot of other things going on in your life like school, other extracurriculars, family, etc., which means you want to prioritize your time on files that you're sure you'll be going for in a lot of instances. Also, it's important to note that debate is generally AF leaning. It is true that they have first speech, the last speech, infinite pref, and AF on this topic is pretty huge. So if you have direct attacks that capitalize on AF weaknesses that we'll talk about later, that's super good for you. It's also good to be on the side of, quote, truth. A lot of judges are averse to voting for what they think are troll arguments like warm and good. Even if you could technically win them, it's good to go for arguments that judges like, such as disads. Okay, so when you're negative, it's really important to know what functional limits are because these are essentially the neg ground that the resolution guarantees you. There are 4 warrants that an affirmative must have to meet every functional limit. These are Arctic key, US key, Fed key, and certainty key. So if you open a 1EC and you notice that they don't have an Arctic key warrant or a US key warrant, then you can capitalize that and go for, say, the Arctic pick because you know that they won't have a good deficit. So then you're ahead on that argument. For dividing the topic, it's good to know the general subsets that AFs can fall into. I would say that there are about 6, where the first is deterrence AFs. So you might have seen AFs like domain awareness, military logistics, or even working with NATO. Though these can generally be responded to by things such as the Russia Dissat, right? The second is cooperation AFs, where instead of deterring Russia, they aim to work with Russia or another country, such as the Russia Cooperation AF or maybe working with China. The third is research AFs. GVN runs a permafrost AF and MBA runs a biodefense AF. These will often be scientific exploration AFs that are more difficult to get concrete decides to, so we'll talk about that later. The fourth is extraction AFs, like DSM Minerals, LNG Pipeline, or Greenland, etc. These have a pretty big range of what they can do, but there are a lot of core generics you can do, such as the public-private partnership counterplan, that are good against these. Then soft left, like New Talk and Land Trust, where maybe it's good to have a politics dissad or go for the SECO K. And then there are some extraneous AFs that don't fit really well into one topic, and that's when it's good to have really, really core generics like the CAP-K. Okay. More on generics, choosing offense is difficult because of link uniqueness. You've probably heard AF teams say things like, the Golden Dome slumps the dissad, which sounds really compelling because it is true that often dissad links aren't specific enough to get past uniqueness problems. One way you can solve this is through something called a uniqueness counterplan. So if you see this example text here, the United States federal government should roll back the Golden Dome from the One Big Beautiful Bill. This is meant to resolve uniqueness issues on a lot of dissads because the Golden Dome isn't operational yet, so by repealing the funding and the resources needed to make it operational, we can essentially get rid of it or fiat away the Golden Dome, which means that the dissad is unique. Here's a quick toolbox of some things that I think is really useful to have prepped out. First is counterplans. The Arctic pick is really, really good and underrated. It's strong against a surprisingly large amount of AFs who don't have a concrete Arctic key warrant, which means you can do it in a different place. For example, you can run the Arctic pick against a lot of mineral AFs that will say the Arctic is key for mineral resources, but you can be like, no, there are a ton in the south of Greenland, which is definitionally not in the Arctic. For disadvantages, I think it's good to have DAs for both sides of the Russia IR divide, which means you have a dissad against deterring Russia, maybe like Putin politics, and a dissad against cooperating with Russia, like appeasement or assurances. Generally, it's good to have an impact defense master file, which we'll release later. And for T, I think it's useful to have T Arctic for AFs that are below 66.5 degrees north, which is the Arctic Circle, and also T minerals. For Ks, settler colonialism is really strong on this topic, and a great generic to have because it links to every app. And the capitalism K is also great because you can go for it against almost everything, so if you encounter an app that you're unfamiliar with, you'll still have something that you can say. The next part is about shielding yourself from losing. When you're negative, there are a lot of things the AF team can do that you might be unprepared for, but a good start is to know your files. You should always have answers to arguments that they make and try to stay organized so that you can find these answers easily. If you realize that you don't have an answer to something that they said, then after the round you should work on finding answers. You can ask us questions, you can ask your coaches, or you can ask your judge. It's also useful to have an RFD doc. Judge feedback is really valuable. A lot of them are truly trying to help you. So if you have a Google Doc with things that judges say, and then you actually take in that feedback and use it in practice, then you'll see yourself getting a lot better. And if you lose to an argument, then you should look for answers on the wiki. You can maybe look at camp files or cut new answers so that you don't lose to it again. And also, when you're going for a new argument or you're uncomfortable with an argument for something maybe like the Russia dissad, then you should have mini debates against your partner or people on your team if you can. So in debate, there are generally three types of ground. The first is dispersive ground, which is where you have an advantage. This is where you want to maximize your offense. So if you remember earlier when we talked about functional limits, if you notice that an AF doesn't meet a functional limit, that means that you have an advantage in that debate because they won't have strong AF ground, e.g. things like deficits, link turns, etc., against that. So you should play to your strengths and maybe realize that that's a better strategy to go for. Contested ground is where you are fighting with your opponent for a key resource or advantage. For example, if this team is really prepared for the Russia Desad debate and you're going for the Russia Desad, maybe you're fighting for who wins whether or not Russia is revisionist, which can still be a very winnable debate. But maybe you want to err towards debates where you have an advantage. Then desperate ground is where your opponent has advantage and where you want to avoid this. For example, if you recognize that your opponent has never lost to Team Minerals and they spent 4 minutes on it in the 1AR, but 30 seconds on the Russia Disat, then you definitely want to go for the Disat because they have a clear advantage on Team Minerals if they just spent way more time on it than you could probably cover in your 2NR. Then the next section is, we talked about this a little bit before, but you should always plan the debate backwards, which means you start from what you want the 2NR to be and the pieces that you want to set up to win, and then you work backwards. So when you're constructing the 1NC, you should be thinking of potential 2NRs, and ideally everything in the 1NC should be a viable 2NR. So if they mess up something in the 2AC or the 1AR, you're able to go for it and explain your arguments without being confused. Then I think this is the last section. It's called the use of spies. This is a great quote. But functionally, spies means that you can use things like the wiki or scouting to find out more about what your opponents are doing in debate. The wiki is open case list, which we'll provide a link to if you don't know what it is. But here you can add your team and disclose your own rounds and then look at what other teams that are going to your tournaments have been running. So then you can figure out what their AF is, unfamiliar positions they run in the 1NC, etc., and make sure that you're prepared to debate them before the tournament. Then scouting, you should look on Taproom to see what teams are going to your tournament and know the teams that you are worried about. It's great to email judges, get 2ACs, and figure out if there is anything that you want to watch out for. Okay, thanks for watching. I'll add a link in the video description to fill out our Google form, and we'll release more videos soon.